Next conversation, A View from the Hill, about protecting our infrastructure. We're delighted to be joined by Congressman John Ratcliffe. He's chair of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Protection and Security Technologies Committee. And Steve, come back.
Congressman, let's go have some fun. This is a great audience. And hello, everybody. I'm Steve. Congressman John Ratcliffe. Congressman Ratcliffe, you have been active in the legislative front, trying to patch holes in the sort of cyber policy arena. You've got two bills you put forward. Can you walk us through them?
Yeah, so one of the things I think everyone in this room knows when we talk about cybersecurity, there's no silver bullet. One of the things early on when I had the opportunity to take over the Cybersecurity Subcommittee at Homeland was recognition of that fact and the fact that we need to use building blocks to get to where we are. We are very much behind the curve when it comes to cybersecurity and protecting our networks, both government networks and private networks across the country. So one of the first pieces that I was tasked with, Chairman McCall and I co-authored a bill that has broad bipartisan support, has passed the House, and is awaiting, we're waiting for the Senate to take action. We think we'll have...
Is the Senate jealous of you actually getting something done?
I hope so,
yeah.
And I hope they're so jealous that this week or next week that they're going to move on their version of what some would call an information sharing bill. I'm hesitant to use that term because you've had some discussion about the fact that we're in a post-Snowden era right now, and sometimes when people hear information sharing and the government, they hear government spying on us. Mm-hmm. The bill that Chairman McCall and I moved off the floor of the House in April is really a sharing of cyber threat indicators. It's sharing a series of ones and zeros. It's sharing information about malware, multi-directional sharing and voluntary sharing, so private to private and private to government. If we're not sharing information with each other, we're all at risk. And so that's an important bill. I do think that the Senate...
So these are signatures, then, of attacks that are anonymized, that can flow between, and they can be used to sort of warn and preempt. I mean, and it's also sort of best practices, right?
It is. And so, one of the concerns, though, back to the Snowden issue is, frankly, the federal government doesn't need your Social Security number. Pretty sure they already have it. And so what our bill does is it requires, frankly, participants, voluntary participants, to scrub out any PII and send only these indicators, these cyber threat indicators that can be used to identify, track, alert of bad actors that are either trying to get in or are already in your networks. Then once it's received through a civilian portal at the Department of Homeland Security, it goes through a second scrubbing to make sure that all PII is out before that information is shared. So I do think that the Senate will move shortly, and the President's indicated that he'll sign some version of this into law. And I think that one of the good things about cybersecurity when we talk about it is we're at a place even here in Washington where there is a lot of bipartisan support and bipartisan recognition of the threat that cybersecurity poses. So that's one important piece of legislation that's already in the works. Another one that I moved through both the Judiciary Committee and Homeland Security Committee by voice vote, and hopefully we'll hit the floor of the House soon, is the Strengthening State and Local Cybercrime Fighting Act of 2015. And really what that does is we talk about filling gaps is, my background is I'm a former terrorism prosecutor. And after 9/11, 9/11 was in many senses a failure of sharing information. We didn't connect the dots of information that we had that could have prevented that. And so in the effort to prevent terrorism going forward, there was really an emphasis on making sure that federal, state, and local partners were all working together, and that this wasn't a federal issue, and that we're trying to turn our state and local officials into force multipliers, if you will, with respect to fighting terrorism. We need to do the same thing with respect to cybersecurity. So my bill authorizes the National Computer Forensics Institute in Hoover, Alabama, which is a federally funded operation run by the United States Secret Service. But what that institute is already doing, and this will just codify it and authorize it into law, is it'll bring in state and local officials to learn the tools that they need to properly handle cyber crimes from soup to nuts, from one end to the other, from investigation to prosecution to judges making decisions. And so what my bill authorizes is it brings in investigators, agents, detectives, brings in prosecutors, brings in judges that have to make the decisions on digital evidence, on cyber-related evidence that is important in fighting crime.
So it's a law enforcement leveler then, right? So, and one other thing, I was actually just during the break looking at HP's report on this, is that one of the great vulnerabilities is at the state and local area, that most of the resources, the literacy, the thinking, the strategies at the federal level, but it's really light when it comes to state and local governments and other agencies. And so it sounds like what you're doing is on the law enforcement side, but it still sounds like there's some big gaps just on the broad literacy challenge. So I'm going to just take your congressman hat off, and you were a mayor, right?
I was a mayor.
Yeah, in Heath, Texas.
I was.
So tell me, in Heath, Texas, which I don't know Heath, where is it near any other big city or around the middle?
It's about 25 miles east of Dallas.
Okay, so near Dallas.
Small town.
But in that area, when you were to sort of think about these issues, like how at that level do these questions of literacy of cyber concerns, whether it's sort of low-level crime or it's something more insidious, how much does that weigh in? Because I think one of the measures here that I worry about, we were just talking about the politics of this, is whether this resonates with the broad American public or not.
Well, I think it does, and it certainly should, because people ask me what do you think the greatest threat facing our nation is, and I say it's our cybersecurity vulnerabilities. It's the threats to our networks. I'm very concerned about this Iranian nuclear deal. I've been outspoken as an opponent of that. But the cyber threats that we face are happening today. These aren't things that are going to happen down the road. The scenarios that I get briefed on every single day could happen today. And this is not, while we do need to have a federal cybersecurity strategy, so much of the vulnerability with respect to our networks and the things that are happen at the state and local level.
So without revealing classified information which you know about, if you were to write a novel, which many congressmen do, what would be the nightmare scenario you would share based on things that you're concerned about?
Well, keep in mind that 85% of our critical infrastructure in this country is actually not controlled by the government. It's in private hands. And so, when we're talking about the networks that protect our bridges, our waterways, our dams, sometimes those are private networks. They're not government networks. So there's any number of sort of cataclysmic scenarios out there where bad actors can, obviously you hear a lot of talk about, the vulnerabilities of our electrical grid, and that's certainly one of them. But, what if terrorists were able to control a nuclear reactor for such a period of time to raise the core temperature that we had a devastating national incident? So there are all sorts of those, unfortunately, and they're not science fiction movie scenarios anymore. They're very real capabilities that are out there. But getting back to sort of the state and local issue, think about it in this terms, a way that I think everyone can understand. When you talk about law enforcement, as a former terrorism prosecutor, I see the importance of that. There's really been two watershed moments in the last 50 or 60 years when it comes to those issues. One is DNA evidence, and you turn on, CSI, and it's the strand of hair, it's the drop of blood that proves the case. Well, the truth is that happens, but it happens in a tiny percentage of cases that your local police departments and law enforcement officials are dealing with every day.
Right.
But in almost every case, digital evidence, and whether we're talking about white-collar crime or whether we're talking about capital murder, it's often a text that's been sent or an online purchase or an email that is the critical piece of evidence that's either going to prove or disprove someone's innocence or guilt. And so just as there's a chain of custody with respect to forensic evidence like blood and DNA, there's also a chain of custody when it comes to digital evidence. And so what my bill does is it will take the investigators that are putting the cases together, the prosecutors that are presenting cyber evidence in court, and the judges that are determining whether or not it should be allowed. It's training them on those techniques. And at the end of the day, it'll coordinate our federal, state, and local people, sort of making sure everyone's on the same sheet of music.
You sound very good at this. And if I wanted a terrorism prosecutor, I'd get you. On a scale of 1 to 10,
would be a pretty good one.
Yeah,
too.
well, I'd stick with you right now. It gets complicated, but on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you see the sort of broad literacy level across the United States? Because you're trying to move that needle. How far do you need to move it?
We need to move it a long way. I mean, I'll be candid with you. One of the good things is I think there is every day, every time everyone opens up the paper and they see the number of intrusions and the impact that it's having on Americans, that's having an effect. But so let me put it in terms of how we're sort of raising people's awareness. So everyone knows about the Anthem the Anthem attack earlier this year, where 80 million Americans had their information compromised. When people read that, it's just a number. It really doesn't mean anything.
So big.
But what happened was, on April 15th, literally tens of thousands of Americans went to file their tax returns and found out someone had already filed their tax returns for them and had requested refunds. And they'd done that with information that was compromised in the Anthem attack. And so they started calling their members of Congress saying, how did this happen? How can this be? How can you let it happen? And so literally, I think one of the reasons that we had such broad bipartisan support for my bill earlier, or the bill that Chairman McCall and I co-authored back in April, was, members of Congress were hearing from their constituents who were now seeing personally the impact of these breaches that they were reading about in the papers.
So there's a marketplace for the sale of that information out there. Why are we, when you mentioned Iran, we've been able to target and sanction individuals in Russia, in Iran, shut down, many corridors of hard money access for North Korea. And a lot of that has been from the financial digital footprints that we see and control. Why are we so bad at shutting down the markets and the trade of this stuff that's stolen?
I think that, one of the primary concerns and issues, one of the reasons for that, I think, is there aren't real clear rules of the road out there with respect to what's going to happen in terms of a deterrent for taking this action, whether it's taken by a cyber criminal or by nation states. So you talk about Iran, obviously. I think last week the president, the U.S. and China engaged in discussions about respecting each other's intellectual property and trade secrets. Well, that's all well and good to have those conversations. But if there aren't real clear consequences to that action, nothing's going to change. And even, James Clapper, our own, director of national intelligence, after that said, this is, what happened last week isn't going to reduce the number of intrusions by the Chinese government, because there aren't consequences to the actions that they've taken. And I think that's one of the next steps that we have to have from a deterrent standpoint. Now, I'm not talking about hacking back. I'm talking about, listen, if this action's taken and we can attribute it, there has to be consequences in terms of sanctions. There has to be consequences in terms of trade. There has to be consequences for the actions that you've taken. We're going to hold you accountable. And if we don't do that, we're not going to arrest and ameliorate this type of activity.
Before I go to the audience, and once you mentioned Trey Gowdy and some of the investigations that he's led, and you've also commented that we need to be much more aware of the cyber capabilities of radical Islamists and others. We had Meg King in here talking about Junaid Hussain, who was one of ISIS's top digital social media guys that we killed. And I guess my question is, there have been a lot of people that have sort of looked at the sophistication of villains that are out there, that are targeting the nation and national security fronts or doing things in the economic sphere. And it seems that we are bad at what they're good at. And if you not to take this too long, if you read David Ignatius's book recently called The Director, it starts as a novel where they go out and you have this hacking community with, piercings and tattoos and a very different culture of arena that essentially are the cutting edge of this. Do you think that there is a mismatch between the culture of Washington and what we're doing and the ability to get the skill sets in place to do battle with the bad guys out there?
No. And I don't want to, get into a deal where this is just a partisan attack, but I mean, I do trace.
Go. I mean,
so you used ISIS as an example. I mean, this is what ISIS has done is they've created a winning brand, if you will. They're attracting people to what they're doing because they've created the perception that they're winning, and through the images, and they have used the disenfranchised in our own community as a force multiplier by creating the perception that they're winning, and they've done that because we haven't had a clear strategy. The president started and initially knocked ISIS as the JV. Then he said ISIS was on the run when clearly what people were seeing on their TVs wasn't the case. And then he admitted that there wasn't a clear strategy with respect to that. So we've been chasing from behind on that. But the fact is, everyone wants to be on a winning team, and if the results on the ground and out in cyberspace both were that ISIS is on a downward curve, they're in a spiral, they're losing territory, and we can do that if we can reverse that. No one wants to join the losing team, and so I'm optimistic about our ability with clear leadership to arrest the progression of groups like ISIS.
Thank you. Let me
need
take
better
a couple of quick questions from the audience. Yes, you had one over here? No? Questions? Yes, right here. Dana Priest. No, Dana Priest. That's Dana Priest. That is the very famous Dana Priest.
No, I just need to follow up on that chapter that Steve is having you write in your book where you talk about the nuclear infrastructure. That sort of begged for a follow-up. Like, do you really worry about the nuclear infrastructure not being secure enough?
Well, let me say this. So within the Department of Homeland Security, the folks in charge of our nuclear facilities and our strategies there they inspire great confidence. I think that we are in good hands with respect to Dr. Huban Gawadia and others that are responsible for that. But across all of our 16 critical infrastructures sectors in this country, there are vulnerabilities, and it would be naive and disingenuous for me to say that we're secure in any of them, much less all of them. And so, to the question about these scenarios, we have to be open about where our vulnerabilities are if we're gonna fix those. So I chose that because it's one that sort of gets everyone's imagination. But I literally could go through all 16 critical infrastructure sectors and give you a scenario that is both realistic and terrifying with respect to having devastating consequences on our economy, or in some cases actually on the American people themselves.
It's interesting, just if I may add, I don't want to mention the company, but I talked to a CEO of a major energy firm with significant nuclear power plants who said that they're under constant assault, at the limit of tens of thousands of efforts a year, which are much greater than I've seen in most of the materials even out that are being distributed today. But of all of those, there have only been 2 breaches. Those were both states, governments and some. Now there were nonetheless still 2, but it raises the fact that the scale of constant effort against these sort of large-scale critical infrastructure, energy or other facilities is really, really profound when you go and talk to any of these CEOs on background.
And we talk about security. Can I just, one of the things I think that you're going to see in the coming years, if you're looking for trends, if you look at all of these network intrusions and breaches that are occurring. We're focused so much on our perimeter security, and companies with firewalls, but increasingly, I think there's recognition that perimeter security is ultimately is so difficult to make sure that every door and window that you've got across a network, in some cases massive networks, is just hard to patrol. And we need to probably be moving towards this idea of more cloud security with the things that we do, and that we'll better be able to protect our information through that technology. And I think you'll see that through the government and through the private sector in the coming years.
Any other quick question? So let me ask you two quickies. One to get you in trouble.
I'm not telling you who's going to be the Speaker of the House. No.
I was going to ask you which speaker candidate is better at cyber.
Let's see. I think that I don't know them all well.
So there's Jason Chaffetz.
Jason Chaffetz, and so Jason is as the chairman of oversight. One of their subcommittees specifically deals with cyber, and Congressman Hurd, chairs that subcommittee. It's an issue that he's dealt with a lot in that role. Of course, Leader McCarthy, in his role, and in fact, in some of the conversations I've had with him, in terms of our Republican conference and the agenda we've tried to move forward, cyber's been a big part of that. I know he's a big advocate. Daniel Webster, I've had a chance to meet with. I haven't had a cyber discussion with him, to be honest, so it wouldn't be fair to say. But I think we'll be. I do think we'll be in good hands, regardless. I think I can say that there's an increasing understanding and emphasis within our conference for the need to promote cyber legislation, these building blocks, and I think that's why that we're seeing bipartisan support, and we're seeing some of these move forward on an expedited basis.
Well, you heard it here. This has probably been the only discussion of the future leader, your future leader and speaker, and cyber. So thank you for handicapping that for us. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. John Ratcliffe, thank you so much.